Welcome back. Chapter 21, Section B. In this video, we want to discuss with together about domestic gross nominal and real GDP. So let's get diving in this interesting subject. So domestic and gross in GDP. Let's break down the meaning of domestic and gross in the context of GDP. Domestic. The term domestic refers to production that occurs within a country's border, regardless of who owns the resources or who produce the goods. In fact, this means that this is different from gross national product or GNP, which includes the production of countries resident, whether they are inside or outside of the country. For example, if Nike earns income from selling shoes in Vietnam, that income is counted in Vietnam's GDP because it is produced within Vietnam. However, it counts as part of the USGNP because Nike is a US company. So domestic production only counts what happens inside the country, not who owns the company or the resources. At the second level, we have gross. The term gross means that GDP is calculated before subtracting depreciation. And depreciation refers to the decrease in value of capital goods over time due to wear and tear. Gross investment includes all spending on new capital goods such as machinery, buildings, or equipment, and also includes the spending needed to replace depreciated capital. Net investment, on the other hand, is gross investment minus depreciation. It shows the actual increase in capital that adds to the economy productive capacity. So, when we talk about the growth in GDP, we are looking at the total investment without subtracting the cost of depreciations. How this fits into the GDP? When we calculate the GDP, we are looking at gross measures, including things like gross profit and gross investment in both expenditure and income approaches to measure GDP. This gives us the total value of productions and income before considering the loss in the value from depreciation. So, in summary, domestic and gross in GDP. Start with domestic. The domestic refers to the production within a country's border, distinguishing it from the national products, which includes production by nations' residents globally. For example, Nike's income from Vietnam is part of Vietnam's GDP, but the United States GNP or gross national product. The second item is gross, that indicate that GDP is calculated before subtracting depreciations. Gross investment includes spending on new capital and replacing depreciated capitals, while net investments equals gross investment minus depreciation. And GDP reflects gross measures including gross profits and gross investments as a part of expenditure and income approach. Here is how you can explain and understand nominal GDP, which is the key concepts when measuring the economy. Nominal GDP measures the value of final goods and services produced within a country in a specific year, but it uses the price of the same year. And this means that nominal GDP doesn't adjust for inflation or changes in price level over time. Let's imagine that in 2021 the price of the car is higher than it was in 2012 because of inflation. If we calculate GDP for 2021 using the prices from the 2021, the increase in GDP could be for two things. First, more cars being produced in 2021. Second, higher prices for the cars as inflation has made them more expensive. So increase in GDP nominal GDP could reflect both higher production and higher prices. And this is important to remember because nominal GDP doesn't separate out the effects of inflation. It simply shows the total value of production at current prices. Next topic is real GDP that we want to talk about that is another important measure of economic growth. Real GDP measures the value of final goods and services produced in a given year, but unlike nominal GDP, it adjusts for price changes. To do this, real GDP uses the price from the reference-based year, often a year like 2012 in this example, and this adjustment allows us to see the actual growth in production without influence of price change over time. For example, let's say we are calculating real GDP for 2021. Instead of using the prices from the 2021, we use the prices from 2012. And this removes the effects of inflation or price increases. So what we're left with the true increase in production, not just the increase in prices. And by adjusting for inflation, real GDP gives a clear picture of how much the economy has really grown in the terms of actual output without the distortion of rising prices. To sum it up, real GDP shows us the real growth in production by using constant price from the base year and giving us a more accurate view of the economy performance over time. If you have any problems or any questions about this, leave them comments, please. In summary, real GDP measures the value of final goods and services produced in the given years but adjusted for price changes by using prices from the reference space. That in example is 2012, and this allows us to see the actual growth in productions without the influence of price change. For example, real GDP for 2021 is calculated using the prices from 2012, and this removes the effects of price increases, so we are left with only the true increase in production. Now let's talk about why real GDP is so important when measuring the economy. Real GDP isolate the impact of price change as we know it from the past parts in production. This means that it allows us to focus solely on how much the economy is actually producing without the influence of inflation or rising prices. This gives us a clear view of whether the economy is truly growing or if the increase in GDP is just for higher prices. So real GDP is especially useful because it provides more accurate comparison of economic output over time. Since it uses a fixed price base year, it keeps prices constant, and this allows us to compare the real growth in the economy without the distortion caused by inflation or deflations. For example, if we look at GDP growth from one year to the next, real GDP tells us if the economy is producing more goods and services, while nominal could simply reflect price increases, making it harder to know if there has been real growth or not. Economists generally rely on estimates of GDP for two main reasons. Let's discuss about them. First, to compare the standard of living over time. One of the key uses of GDP is to measure how a country's standards of living change over time. By looking at real GDP growth, economists can track whether people in a country are, on average, getting wealthier or facing economic struggles. If GDP is growing, it usually indicates that the economy is producing more goods and services, which often translate to better jobs, higher wages, and an improvement in the standard of living for people. The second purpose is to compare the standard of living across countries. The first one is over time, the second one is across the countries. So we want to use the GDP to compare the standard of living between different countries, and by comparing GDP figures, we can see which countries are more economically developed and which are less developed. This comparison can highlight differences in incomes, access to goods and services, and overall quality of life. However, when comparing across countries, it's also important to consider factors like population size and differences in the cost of living, which is why economists often adjust GDP using metrics like GDP per capita. In summary, GDP helps economists understand how a standard of living is changing within a country over time and how it compares to other nations. If you have any questions again or want more example, you can leave them in the comments part below. To compare the standard of living over time, economists uses a key measure called real GDP per persons. In fact, real GDP per person is a measure of the value of goods and services that the average person in a country can enjoy. It's calculated by dividing real GDP, which we have already learned in the adjusted for inflation, by the population. And this gives us a per person figures and help us to understand how much the average individual has access to the terms of economic output. But what is the purpose of real GDP per person? The main purpose of real GDP per person is to allow for comparison of the standard of the living over time. By using real GDP, which accounts for inflation, we can track whether the average person's well-being is improving or declining as the economy grows or shrinks. It gives us, in fact, a clearer picture of how economic growth translates into real benefits for individual. The next purpose of compare standard of living over the time lead to fluctuation around potential GDP. Real GDP per person doesn't stay constant. It fluctuates around something called potential GDP. In fact, potential GDP is the maximum level of output an economy can produce without causing inflation. If the economy is producing below its potential, it might indicate underutilized resources or economic slack. On the other hand, if it's producing above potential, it could signal overheating and inflationary pressure. So, by looking at real GDP per person, we can better understand how the average person's standard of living is changing over time, while also accounting for inflation. This helps us see whether economic growth is actually benefiting individuals. If you have any questions or wants to more examples or deeper into the topics, leave a comment below. In summary, real GDP per person is a measure of value of goods and services that average person can enjoy and calculate by dividing real GDP by the populations. The purpose of that is allows for comparison over time and adjusting for inflation by using real GDP. Fluctuates around the potential GDP, which is the maximum level of output an economy can produce without causing an inflation. Thank you so much for your precious attention. Please follow this video to section C, the next part of this chapter.